I was in the town earlier today thinking, do you know, everything looks a little bit like normal. And then I saw a woman walking along with one of those masks on her face. And it reminded me immediately what we'd been through over the last couple of years. And I thought, and I started to reflect and had a little recap of what had happened. I remember in November 2019, when we started to hear about this mysterious virus that nobody knew what it was in China. Videos had been started to leak into the public consciousness of people falling down in the street, just collapsing with some horrible virus. And then we started to see that the Chinese government were locking them up and in some cases welding people in their homes, which seemed absolutely horrific. Of course, it wasn't long before we were aware that this virus, whatever it was, that some strange thing that happened in a wet market, I'd never heard of wet markets before then, had managed to get into aeroplanes by travellers and started crossing across the world. And before we knew it, Italy was having huge numbers of deaths thanks to this strange virus that we now started to know was called COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-19. And again, we started to think, well, thank goodness it's not over in this country, here in the UK. But of course, we still had aeroplanes coming in. Nobody thought to stop the traffic coming into this country if it was going to be this pandemic that we were told was on its way. And then in January, we started to count the cases of this weird virus, SARS-CoV-19. A few cases here and a few cases here. And then it started to build up rather rapidly. And before we knew it, Boris Johnson was on our screens every evening telling us how dreadful this was. And then one time in March, towards the end of March, towards the end of March, he told us, I happened to be away with the lovely Julia, staying overnight in an Airbnb. We're going to have to ask you to lock yourself down. We're going to go and people have got to stay at home. Wash your hands, all this business. So we came home and we locked ourselves down. And suddenly it was 3 weeks to flatten the curve. We were doing this to save the NHS. And of course, it was rather frightening because the mainstream media kept telling us how awful it was and we kept hearing the death count. And as the year started to progress, we came out of lockdown for a little bit and then we went back into it again. And we had another government, of course, the shadow government, who instead of saying, well, hang on, is this actually necessary? Do we need to do this? What about the Great Barrington Declaration? Surely we should, instead of everybody locking themselves down, we should perhaps just protect the vulnerable people. We knew that it was actually affecting people over 80 and people with comorbidities, that the majority of the people would be fine, that herd immunity would have sorted it all out. But no, we're following the science. We have to follow that. Look, I've got a couple of experts either side of me who tells me we follow the science, as if science was only in one direction, even though eminent virologists and other scientists had a different opinion. But we weren't allowed to, of course, listen to any other opinion other than the one opinion, which was that we should all lock down. No cost analysis benefit given. Nobody worried about what might happen if you lock down a population. And in fact, this was something that had always been ruled out and never to lock down a population. But on this particular occasion, no, we had to lock everybody in. Never mind that there might be people depressed, that families who were never used to being in the same room for any length of time and the pressure of that might cause problems, that children might suffer, that there might be suicides, that people would be losing their jobs. But it's all right. There was such suddenly magic money. A tree had been discovered that was sprouting money left, right and centre. No worry to the economy down the line. We would pay for that later. It wasn't going to be a problem. people were paid to stay at home. Not everybody qualified. I didn't qualify. I never got a cent out of the government for staying at home. And yet, of course, I had to stay at home, although I did manage to go out and do a few walks and make a few videos and try and keep my head above water, and then was slated for going out because I was going to be spreading COVID that I didn't have. So we all locked ourselves down, and still there was this one message, and the mainstream media kept battering us and frightening us about we shouldn't kill Granny. And we carried on for the whole year. Nobody questioning the science, although some people were questioning it. But of course, if you mentioned it, if you put your concerns out onto social media, the social media platforms pounced on you. You were heretics. You weren't allowed a difference of opinion. You had to stay within these one set of guidelines because it was that or nothing. We clapped for the NHS, for the National COVID Service. Although if you actually had COVID, you weren't allowed anywhere near the NHS, the hospitals, unless, of course, you were on your deathbed, and that was pretty much the only time you could go there. And you weren't able to go and see a GP because they had shut the shutters down, and that was it. So we got through towards the end of the year, and then Boris said, sorry, we're going to cancel Christmas. Pardon? Yes, you couldn't see anybody at Christmas. It was you and the turkey, and the turkey was already dead, and you were next if you ventured out or saw anybody else. Of course, we had weddings had been cancelled and people couldn't go to funerals. We had the problem with all the patients in hospitals being shipped out to the care homes, not worrying about the people in the hospitals who may have been affecting people in care homes and all the problems that caused and the mountains of death. But it didn't matter because we had this running death toll that was continually thrust into our face, and we were worried witless by it. Most of us, although those people who were questioning it were doing this underhand and perhaps managing to talk to other people when we were allowed in our so-called bubbles of six and things like that. And we got through to the end of the year, and the only thing that we had, the light at the end of the tunnel, of course, was this vaccine. The magic juice was coming. People were working tirelessly on a magic juice that could get rid of COVID-19. Never mind that the common cold has never been magically worked out how to save that with an injection. You don't get a vaccine against the common cold, which most of it is some sort of SARS-based thing anyway. But no, we can do it. The people, the technological people in their white coats were able to come up with a solution, and it's going to come. So we all had to just sit tight, those of us who didn't die of either from fright or from panic or anything else that we were forced upon us. And so we waited. We cancelled Christmas and we waited, and then the vaccine became available to those people in their 80s or people with comorbidities. And of course, they were given it, and we thought, thank goodness, perhaps the rest of us can get back to life. No. In your tears, you had to stay because more and more people had to have the vaccine. In fact, the process was that everybody had to have the vaccine. It didn't matter then that you could all go everywhere and everyone would be fine as long as everybody had the vaccine. And in fact, if you didn't have the vaccine, you had the potential of losing your job, which many people did, of course. No job, no jab, no job. Ex-prime ministers came out and said, if you don't have the vaccine, if you're a bit hesitant about having it, if you're slightly worried that it's been magically made so quickly and not really tested with any long-term things, despite the fact that other vaccines have decades of testing, but this magic juice somehow, because it's got new things that hadn't been tested on human beings before, we'll just give it to you. Never mind what might happen to pregnant women or those unborn babies once they come into the world, because we've never really tested it on any of that. If you don't have it, you're an idiot, an absolute idiot. Why would you not have this magic thing? And the GPs and the doctors who might even question it were not allowed to question it, because if they questioned it, then they would lose their jobs, although a couple of them did. And I remember one chap in front of the, I can't even remember the bloke's name now, he was so in a fit, he came and went in a jiffy bag, health secretary, and he stood up on television and said, well, I'm a bit nervous about this because it's been ever so quick. But anyway, that was the magic juice, and soon everybody had it, and we had the mandates, and we had the passwords, and not the passwords, we had the passports, and everybody had to have it. And of course, you were a complete idiot if you didn't have it, although many of us did resist. And then, of course, it wasn't just one jab, you had to have 2 jabs. And it wasn't just 2 jabs, you had to have boosters. And then it wasn't just one booster, you had to have another booster. This wonderful thing that was going to save us from everything suddenly turns out not to be quite as efficable as it was sold to us. Instead of being these 2 jabs and away you go, you're constantly having to be jabbed. But people were slightly nervous about it because there became these rumours about blood clots and other incidences. But no one was able to talk about that. No. But there's still only the one science. It's the only science. And our shadow government continued to tell us, if you're going to lock down, we want you to lock down more. We want more people to have that. We want more vaccines. Despite the fact, of course, that even Pfizer eventually admitted that they'd never tested the vaccine to see if it would stop it being spread. So the whole point of having COVID passports was sort of absolute rubbish, and so the government had mandated these things and implemented them, and there was absolutely no need whatsoever. Meanwhile, of course, smaller businesses were going under, the hospitality industry was disappearing, but large corporations, those ones that were online, those ones that were absolutely necessary, those people who had these businesses were making huge amounts of money. And people were panicking. The cost analysis benefit was slowly beginning to be understood, that we should have maybe not locked down because there were people who had cancer and who hadn't come forward and gone to their doctors because they couldn't see a doctor, or the doctors didn't want to know them, and the hospitals wouldn't allow them in, and those people with mental health issues. And when we'd shut the schools, those kids who couldn't see the lips of parents or the lips of the teachers, they had these masks in front of their faces. And as we came to the end of 2021, we discovered that we had governments that were lying to us. Some of them had been travelling to Bernard Castle. It was all right for them, one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. Boris Johnson was having parties left, right and centre. One rule for him and one rule for... Well, we weren't going to have that for any length of time, were we? So in the end, we got shot of Boris Johnson somehow or other. And in fact, we got rid of the Health Secretary Hancock. He was discovered with his hand on his mistress and in a camera in the office, which all seemed a little bit suspicious, but maybe, and I'm not saying it is, but maybe that was one way that he was able to get out of government. So the people that gave us and made the architect of this lockdown COVID pandemic in the UK suddenly were no longer there. And the man who dished out the magic beans, regardless of how we were going to pay it later on, is now the Prime Minister in 2022. How did that come about? He had no mandate from the people, and he had even no mandate from the Conservative Party. But there he is, and he's sort of saying, well, don't worry, I'll get you out of the crisis. Well, hang on a minute, you put us in the financial crisis of this. And what did we learn as we came into 2022? We learned that the government had a nudge unit that was nudging us and telling us what we should do, that if you sat on a park bench and had a cup of coffee, you would be arrested. If you wandered into the Peak District, one of the safest places to be away from the COVID-19 virus, you would have a drone above your head and the police would come out and arrest you. And many people were fined, only to find that these fines actually were null and void in the end, and all that fear was no good. But if you went and protested, which is of course people's right, the police would come down on you like a ton of bricks. We realised that the police had extraordinary powers to do this. That social media companies could, any information they didn't like became misinformation. And now at the end of 2022, here we are, people are suddenly able to discuss things that they were previously not allowed to discuss in those last 2 years. The fact that actually this leak from a potential virus laboratory in Wuhan wasn't just the wet lab, but it might have been a leak. It might have been an accident that it came out. Perhaps it came out too soon. The other thing that we've learned is, as we've been able to discuss this, that actually more people are skeptical about it. More people were hesitant about these things, that not everybody played the game. And some people are regretting ever having had the magic juice put into their arms, because there's various rumours about how healthy it is actually to have this stuff in you. And as we approach 2023, I wonder if there is a cabal of people, the puppet masters, the elites that are guiding the world, and they wanted to make sure that everybody had this magic juice, because there may be something in it that's not very healthy for everybody. Maybe actually they've missed a trick. Maybe they're not as clever as they think they are, because actually this has been a huge wake-up call for a lot of people. More people are discussing what has happened over the last few years. More people are aware of how the government doesn't really like them. They don't seem to be very concerned about the citizens. More people are anxious about what the governments might try and do in the future, all the people who are running the governments behind the scenes. I think they have missed a trick. I think we are all become more aware of what's going on. The expression that people have woken, I think, is very true. That now if they try and manipulate us in the same way, I think more people will be coming forward to question it. I think the mainstream media has shown themselves for what they were. They're backtracking about it now. But I think we know. And I think that it's been actually, although it's been a horrific time for a lot of people, and some people regret having gone through it, of course, I think that actually we are in a far, far better place for knowing what sort of people there are out there running this country, running the planet. So if we decide, do you know what? Actually, we don't want a global government, that we don't want a digital money that is operated across the world, run by one bank. If we don't want all of this, that if actually we prefer to have smaller communities where we look after one another, where we count, I think we're in a much stronger position. And I think they know it. And I think they're terrified, because there's more of us than there are of them. And I think we're in a good place as long as we stay aware and don't swallow any more of the rubbish that's been coming down the system.